Hello comic book guys and gals, and welcome to Comic Mag Musings. This fella's your host, Bill Miller. Very excited. We are doing a support video and a contest entry for the Graders Note Crew contest. The Graders Note Crew, or gang if you will, consists of Metarog, ComicHead 84, Genome Presents, and Mr. Miracle Comics. So here are the rules for this contest. You must be 18 or older. US and Canadian residents get the prize package. International residents get a PayPal amount. You must sub up all of the Graders Notes crew, and I will leave their links in the description of this video. And you make a short video, short's a relative term, doing a Graders Notes style review of any comic book of your choosing using the 5 following criteria: cover, interior art, story, concept, and overall grade. Each of those categories are assigned a grade from theoretically 0 to 5, 5 being the highest, and 0.5 or half point levels or increments have typically been used. The contest closes at noon Eastern Standard Time on July 8th. So if you're going to make an entry, you have to do it very quickly. I will try to make this as quick as possible, although it will take a little bit of time. The comic book that I will be grading is Hellboy, Conqueror Worm #1. This guy right here. So this is a fairly well-loved copy that I picked up recently. This is published by Dark Horse in 2001. Story, art, and cover by Mike Mignola. It's a 4-issue series, and Mignola does that a lot, right? He'll do either one-shots or little 4-issue, 3-issue, sometimes 5 series. Oftentimes enough that can be collected into a trade. Before I begin, I want to take a quick time out. Simon from Simple Simon is really into the goth girls. Well, this is a public service announcement for Simon. I've got the answer for you right here. So the next Mike Mignola book signing, be there. You won't be able to go a couple feet without tripping over 100 goth girls camping out in line to get his signature. Let's go up to the first one that you see. Start a conversation with her. You know, crikey, you like Hellboy too? And she'll go, I don't know. I guess he doesn't really suck. And you can say, wow, I know, right? Anyways, what you listening to there? Is that My Chemical Romance? They're a great band. You know, Gerard Way, he writes comics too. And she'll say, yeah, thanks for the scoop, Jimmy Olsen. I've only got an Umbrella Academy tattoo on my forearm. And you say, yeah, well, anyways, it looks like we're really hitting it off, you know? So I was wondering, would you like to go out on a date? And then she'll go, whatever, we're all gonna die eventually anyways. Then you go, super, so I'll pick you up at 7 o'clock tonight. And that is how you will get your first date with one of many goth girls. All voice impersonations performed by Bill Miller. Thank you. Now time in. All right, so let's go over this comic book. The first thing we're going to look at, and I need to get my notes, is the cover. So let's take a look at the cover. And we'll bring it in closer. All right, so I like the trade dress, right? It's classic for Hellboy. It's eye-catching. It informs without overpowering. And the Dark Horse logo is muted too, which I like. I love the imagery. This isn't the best depiction of Hellboy, but it's good enough. You got Lobster Johnson right there. You've got a World War II era German soldier, right? You can tell by his uniform. He's a Wehrmacht soldier. As you can tell by the symbol on the helmet. He's not an SS soldier. They should have stopped there. They being Mike Mignola. He should have stopped there. I like that it's got plenty of room for the images, but what I don't like is I don't like the Lobster Johnson calling card here. And I don't like the inset picture of Roger right there. Now, don't get too excited, Metarog. See, right now, Roger's kind of marching around with his chest puffed out. I'm on the cover of a comic book. Not that Roger, a different Roger. This Roger's a homunculus, which is like a humanoid created by an alchemist. So, to me, it feels like it's just thrown on there. It's unnecessary. Mignola covers are best when they're simple, suggestive, evocative, interactive, meaning you need to kind of dig a little bit in the cover, understated. I think those are his best covers. And I think that this was going along that route. I like the Hellboy, Lobster Johnson, the soldier, right? I like the background, but I don't like the calling card here. I think that it's unnecessary. I think it's visually disjointed. I don't think it adds enough to pull you into the comic book. I think just having Lobster Johnson here was enough. I think this was superfluous. And the picture of Roger, I think it's cluttered, makes the comic look cluttered. Looks like it's hastily added, makes it look busy. Mignola's like draws inspiration from pulps and Golden Age superheroes. If you wanted to do like an inset of 2 or 3 different squares or circles or something like that, little portrait circles, and he could have had Roger there and a calling card there, or some image or item that he felt a story element that was important to the story, then I think that would have been preferred if he insisted on having them there. I think you just remove them all together and you have a much better cover. So it's tough to say, exactly how you judge this cover, right? Obviously, to judge anything, it can't be in a vacuum. You have to have the yin and yang, right? You don't have good without bad. You don't have up without down. You don't have smart without dumb. So, as much as I want to judge this in isolation on its own merits, there has to be comparisons to at least other comic book covers that whomever is judging is familiar with, right? So if no one has ever read a Hellboy cover before, they're going to have a different pool of comparisons with which to make. I have read plenty of Hellboy, and so that's probably the default to my comparison criteria. And I just think that this is serviceable, but it's lacking. It's certainly not among some of his better cover art, or at least cover composition, because the art is good. But I think that in this particular case, less is certainly more. The back cover is nice. I like that. It's very muted, monochromatic, it's mysterious, it's intriguing. And if he went conceptually more in this direction, I think the front cover would have benefited. Now, I'm not counting the back cover, because I think in the spirit of Grader's notes, you typically focus on the front cover, what's going to draw you in, what's going to make you want to buy that comic book. And so I'm going to judge this on the merits of the front cover alone. So with that being said, my grade is a 3.0, which isn't bad, but he's done a lot better work. All right, moving right along, not really. We got interior art. So Mignola art, there are generally three camps, right? You either love it and you love it immediately, or it kind of takes a little while and it grows on you, begin to enjoy it and appreciate it. Or you just don't like it, and no matter how often you're exposed to it, you never develop an appreciation, or perhaps you develop an appreciation, but you never develop an enjoyment from it. So it's definitely very distinctive, right? Not everyone likes it, but I think it's tough to argue that it's not distinctive. You see his art, and you know pretty quickly that if that's not Mignola art, it's one of his books that another artist has worked on to make it seem as though it were his art. For several years, he only wrote and he didn't do art, so he had other artists doing oftentimes the covers and certainly the interior art, but they aped his style pretty faithfully. So it was a pretty smooth transition back and forth from his work, their work, back to his work, because he didn't know when he was going to be providing art for different issues. And so it's pretty congruous throughout, because of the way that those other artists were able to mimic his style, and it's a very distinctive style. He's obviously heavily influenced by Gothic art and architecture, and I'll show you some examples in here. So if we look here, we've got the castle ruins, right? He's all about castles, gargoyles, grotesques, statues, relics, and those litter his artwork. There's a beautiful image of a statue of a woman and child / demon child. I don't know, hard to say. He's big into skeletons, monsters, witches, paranormal, science experiments gone wrong. There's some skeletal remains right there. Those litter his stories. There's a monster, if you will, / science experiment. His story is told in the shadows. There are always subtle clues kind of hiding in the darkness. It's almost like your eyes have to get adjusted to his style of art, which is heavy with the blacks, the grays, the blues. And so once it gets adjusted, example, that's typical, right? This very dreary, very dark, foreboding, very shadowy. Lots of different shades of blacks. And sometimes you need to really go over a panel several times to take it all in and to identify little bits and pieces that seem to be casually stuck in the background that may be an important part of the story or may seem to have importance later on. He's very distinctive with his faces. So there's an example. Where we go? Right there, right? They're stone-like, shadowy, male or female. You can look at a character or a figure, especially if you have a good headshot, and know that Mignola is the one that did that. He has great use of color for emphasis. Because everything is so monochromatic, it does present the opportunity to add emphasis with color, like right here, right? It's very exciting, riveting, jarring. It pops out at you. And it can really add a lot of drama to a particular panel or series of panels that he would like to emphasize. And I enjoy his use of black and white for flashback scenes. So right there's an example. Where is it? There it is. Right there. And another one right there. So one thing that I probably could have done without, and it's difficult when the writer is also the artist. It can be a challenge to separate the story from the art, but I'll put this on the art side. Kind of silly, right? Kind of silly. You can see in those German officer uniforms that we're dealing with World War II era German army right here. I don't know that you'd need swastikas on the lab coats, so didn't make a whole lot of sense. Kind of silly, but that's kind of being nitpicky. I'd say overall for the interior art, I would grade him a 4.0. So now on to the story. Brief summary of it. It's the late 30s, and Nazi scientists are essentially launching a rocket into space. Lobster Johnson attempts to stop them but fails. Over 60 years later, the rocket is re-entering the Earth's orbit, has made a couple corrections, and if it makes no further corrections, it is on course to head straight for the castle tower from whence it came 60 years prior. The BPRD, which is the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense, decides that they want Hellboy and Roger to investigate this. An Austrian guide leads them to the castle and ultimately into what could be a trap. because Franken Gorilla, who I showed you earlier, is waiting for Hellboy. And that's kind of the synopsis of the plot without giving too much of it away. And there's our Franken Gorilla. He being Mignola does a really good job with the establishing shots and kind of bringing you in, inviting you in, immersing you into the story really quickly, right? So those are two common ways to do it, with a series of establishing shots or with jumping into an action scene, punching you right in the mouth immediately. So he uses some establishing shots, which obviously get smaller, smaller, smaller. So now you see the Austrian countryside. Now you see the castle, and then closer on the castle, and then a German soldier as you get closer and closer. The cadence and the structure of this particular story are sort of set in motion and kept on time at key points throughout the story by a poem by Edgar Allan Poe called Liaya. And there it is. Tells you right there. So it's pretty good. And that's where, well, I won't give too much into it. What I will say is that if he was determined to use Poe, I think something like Annabelle Lee would have been a better choice. I think that it would have lent itself to further exploring the relationship between Hellboy and Roger. Not in a romantic sense, like the poem, but in a platonic sense. I think that there was opportunity there to kind of delve a little bit deeper into their relationship during this issue. But it would have lost some of the pacing that this particular choice helped establish. So I think that was pretty good. Much of the story is conveyed in the gutters. There are definitely some imagery that are left open to interpretation, particularly from one panel to another, that might require a little bit more interactivity from the reader than your typical comic book. And that's just his style, and it seems to work for him, especially for something that is a quote-unquote horror comic or a gothic comic. It's definitely worthy of several reads to uncover some of the clues, to gaze at some of the amazing art. Some of it is so dark that, and I know a lot of people don't like that, right? It's essentially like shadowing and covering up incredible art. But if you spend the time to kind of peer into it and peel away the layers of darkness, you see some really incredible art and some things that maybe you didn't see on the first pass or even the second pass. It's a quick read, like he's not very text heavy, but I think he wants you to linger on each panel a little bit, at least more than you traditionally would for a comic book. But it's got a good, fast pacing to it. And I think that's because the story is kind of sandwiched between two action sequences, one close to the beginning and one at the very end. And I think they act as a vice to almost squeeze the story in between and help keep that pacing going. And when it seems to lull, or the potential for a lull is there, I think that his coupling with the poem kind of helps maintain that pace and bring everything back to a center point. So he's definitely influenced by the pulps, and Lobster Johnson, without giving away too much of that, but Lobster Johnson is a pulp character. The government maintains he's a fictitious character, and the BPRD is a representative of the government, so that's their official stance. But Hellboy seems to think otherwise. Inside of the front cover, you'll notice this on there, on most of them, it says 17. So this is an attempt to help establish continuity within the Hellboy universe, right? So this is issue number 1 of a 4-issue miniseries. And sometimes he has one-shots, and obviously he has other miniseries. But it's an erratic, kind of sketchy publishing schedule that he's on. So this, although this book contains a self-contained story and references to other events or characters are footnoted, it definitely does reference those events and characters from previous issues. So it certainly helps provide a little bit of a contextual richness if you've read the other issues. And that's kind of a way to keep track of the chronology of the Hellboy releases. So that's pretty neat. The ending, which I'm not going to go into, definitely leaves you wanting more. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I will give the grade of 4.0 for the story. Now on to the concept. It can be a challenge to separate this particular issue from the Hellboy universe, right? We have Hellboy, we have Lobster Johnson, who's spun off, Abe Sapien, the BPRD. He's created this whole universe, essentially, he being Mignola. And so it's tough to kind of cut this tiny little slice out of it and say conceptually, how is this contributing something new or different? So I would say that that's my focus for concept, is this specific issue. If it were the concept of Hellboy, it'd be like a 4.5 all day long. But for this particular issue, there's nothing groundbreaking, nothing particularly different in the book. It uses many of his common tropes, right? We've seen them. The art's the same. The fight scenes against a scientifically created monster. BPRDs involved. Skeletons, skeletal remains. Gothic architecture. All of that is in here. And those are all common things that Mignola puts in several of his, nearly all of his books. I like that he's true to what made Hellboy successful. And I think that the Lobster Johnson subplot is promising, right? There's not much meat on the bone in this particular issue, but it hints at something special in the future. So with that in mind, and given the fact that there's not a whole lot he can do with, number one, staying true to this common thread that he's been weaving throughout his books, and giving his fans what they have grown accustomed to enjoying, I think that he might have had a small opportunity to do something a little bit novel, and he didn't take it, at least in this particular issue. So I will give this a very respectable 3.5 for concept. Overall, I thought that the cover was very serviceable, but could have been a lot better, and better by going back to a minimalist standpoint. I felt that the story was very strong, as are most of his stories, because he gets them from fairy tales, myths, legends, not just from this country but throughout the world. That's kind of his that's his source material, if you will. I thought the interior art was very good, very strong, and I thought the concept was understandably handcuffed, but with what he had to work from, I don't think he really did anything particularly trailblazing in this issue. So it's a tough one for overall. I'm going to give it a 3.5, a high 3.5, but a 3.5 nonetheless. And that is my review of Hellboy, Conqueror, Worm #1. What did you think? I'm interested to see what you think of the issue. Please give it the grade treatment in the comments for cover, interior art, story, concept, and overall. I'd love to see what you think about that. I'd like to thank the Graders Notes crew for hosting this contest. Again, that's Metarog, ComicHead 84, Mr. Miracle Comics, and Genome Presents. If I am fortunate enough to win, I would be happy to accept the one-time appearance as a guest grader. As for the comic books, and there are going to be some good ones knowing this group, I would humbly prize tag 64-page special. I will have that Rascals link in the description as well. He makes great videos, particularly contest videos. Now I know he's in Canada, and even though it's open to Canada, I know shipping is more, so I would be happy to pay for shipping to get those books to him. And that will do it. I appreciate everyone for watching. I would encourage you to subscribe to all the channels that I've mentioned if you haven't done so already. And one last thing, remember, we're taking over the world. One comic book, boom, at a time. Thanks.